Hello, it's Matt McLachlan. Before we get to this week's podcast, I wanted to extend a very special invitation to you. In August 2025, my signature tour is heading back to the Western Front, and I'd love you to come with me. We're going to explore the battlefields of France and Belgium and tell the entire story of the Australians during the First World War. It's going to be an amazing trip. We're going to visit the Somme, we're going to visit the Ypres Salient, French Flanders, famous battlefields such as Passchendaele, Pozières, Villers-Bretonneux, Bullecourt, Fromelles, and many more. Now, this is the only tour I'm going to personally escort to the Western Front in 2025. So if you'd like to come with me, please don't wait. The tour sells out very, very quickly. It departs Paris on the 30th of August, 2025, and you can find full information at our website, which is battlefields.com.au.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
A Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello and thank you for joining us on another episode of Living History. This week we have a topic that I'm really excited about and I've actually wanted to bring to you for quite a while. We're going to be talking, this is a tale of resistance fighters, secret agents, espionage, behind-the-lines activities, and all focused on some very impressive women. And here to tell us the story is Clare Mulley. Clare, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me on.
Now, we've crossed paths a couple of times in recent years. At the We Have Ways festival last year, we caught up there, and you did a couple of excellent presentations there. But we actually had a sort of a loose connection before that, because on a trip a couple of years ago, I was staying in London, and I was staying in Lexham Gardens, and just down the road, I noticed a blue plaque which told the story of someone we are going to discuss called Christine Granville. And then I tweeted about it and then actually communicated with you. You probably don't even remember, but we briefly discussed it on Twitter and just the significance of that, because you were responsible for that blue plaque being placed on that building, as I recall.
I was indeed, yeah. It took quite a long time. It took 6 years to get that plaque up, a couple of years to get English Heritage on side. We had to obviously find lots of sources to prove that she had lived in that building. And then the hotel was slightly resistant to it. But we got a campaign going with one of the newspapers, and I'm delighted. Of course, when it was unveiled, sadly, it was COVID, so then we couldn't have anyone there. So thanks for mentioning it. I want everyone to know about it.
Well, it's in Lexham Gardens in the Kensington area of London, so go and check that out. And in a way, I think the story of that plaque reflects these stories we're going to be discussing. It's women who did amazing things, but perhaps haven't received the recognition that they deserve for those great actions. So I think the story of that plaque probably reflects that somewhat.
Yeah, I think so. So great. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about these women.
Well, let's start with you. For those of our listeners who aren't familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about you and what you do and how you came to specialise in these amazing stories of women in World War II.
Okay, well, I am a public historian of women in war, essentially women's experiences in the Second World War, though I have touched on the First World War a little as well. And I'm a broadcaster, author of now 5 books. And the last one is just out last week, so hot off the press. That's Agent Zoe. And how did I get to the stories? My first book was actually about an English woman, the wonderful Eglantine Jebb. And she was the founder of Save the Children, the International Development Agency, and I know they operate in Australia as well. And she was absolutely fantastic. She was this strident Edwardian woman who wouldn't take no for an answer, who got arrested. And she was out in a war zone, what became the First World War. She was out there beforehand doing what we could say human rights work and distributing aid, but also investigating war crimes. It's pretty dangerous stuff, actually. I had to slip away from the Serbian hosts who were escorting her in her area. And managed to research a list of murdered men and smuggle that back to the British. So really impressive woman. And one of the many things I love about her is also she didn't like children very much. She called them the little wretches, but she went on to set up Save the Children because she was looking at children as the next generation for peace, stability, and because they are some of the most vulnerable and need to be the first to receive aid, and lots of reasons for it. But she was totally unheard of. And I loved her story. So that's what set me off. So I wrote her book and delighted that won Daily Mail Prize for Biography over here. And I haven't looked back since. I moved forward a war because I wanted to catch some of those stories before they disappear. You know, I feel we can just interview the last veterans, some of the children who are witnesses in that war, like my own mother, and capture some of those stories. So I focused on the Second World War since then.
Wonderful. And we're going to tell a couple of those stories in a little bit more detail a little bit later in the interview. But the recent book is all about resistance fighting. It's about the training of resistance fighters with SOE in Britain and the close cooperation between resistance fighters and an official program in Britain to train people and help with espionage. And
yes.
Can you give us the broad picture of what was going on with this at this time with SOE and resistance fighters, and particularly the role of women in this complicated network of espionage?
Yeah, absolutely. So when the Second World War started, there were a lot of women in military auxiliaries, and there were a lot of women actually in the front line pretty early on. So you had women who were serving as searchlight operators, for example, as enemy aircraft came into British airspace, or manning the machine, doing the mathematics calculating for the anti-aircraft guns. They weren't actually allowed to pull the triggers on these things, although of course they did. But officially they weren't. They were doing the calculations, and then a man had to come in and pull the trigger. There were, of course, women on the home front as well, working on the fields, in the factories, that sort of thing. But in lots of Europe, of course, there isn't that distinction between the front line and the home front. So if you are in Poland, the first country that's invaded, the home front is immediately the front line. And Poland had a large women's military auxiliary. They also had something called the PWK, which were service women who were armed, trained and uniformed, but were outside the official armed forces structures in Poland. So they're a bit like in Britain, the first aid nursing yeomanry, and I'm sure that there's an equivalent where you are. And they immediately went into action. And my woman, Zoe, was one of the very first women to serve in the Second World War, because on that morning, she was woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning by hearing a series of explosions that sort of shook the room of her. She was staying in a dorm room with some of her colleagues at the time. And she thought at first it must be the Polish Air Force undertaking exercises. But it was the Blitzkrieg. It was the start of the German invasion that plunged the world back into war. And she, within minutes is in uniform and going out, and she's deployed to serve in the front line in Lviv. So that was the beginning of her work. But your interest is particularly with the resistance. And Poland, put up a good fight, but they actually, and their government never conceded. They never had a collaborationist government. So they managed to get their government and 35,000 troops and the Enigma code breakers, the first code breakers of the Enigma machine, and some of their treasures, their state finances were all brought out to France. And after the fall of France, they served in the Battle of France, they were moved to Britain. But within Poland, there was another army, the Resistance Army, and it was actually the largest resistance army in Europe. And I think all too often when we think of the resistance, and particularly women in the resistance, we tend to think of France. And there's some fantastic history there. And the women that SOE worked with, many more of them were parachuted to France. There was only one woman who was parachuted to Poland. But actually, the Polish resistance was the first, and it was the largest organised resistance in occupied territory. And they were called the Home Army, as opposed to the army overseas. And they did extraordinary work. At the end of the war, actually, Churchill commissioned a report to see where Britain's strategic military intelligence had come from on the enemy. And he discovered that almost half of that had come from Poland. And the rest of it came from France, a little bit from Belgium and other occupied nations as well. That's within the European arena. And so you can see the importance of the work and it's largely women operating. And there is a reason why women were specifically working in this area. If you are in the resistance overseas, women did have a superpower. It is gender specific. And that superpower, people tend to think it's to be a honey trap, to be attractive, to seduce the enemy and get information. And that's not it. I mean, sometimes these women did do that because they would use any tool they had. They'd use any weapon they had. And if that is, using some level of flirtation, then they would do that if they needed to. But the real superpower that all women had in the 1940s, in the wartime, and some would argue still today, is that women tend to be overlooked and underestimated. And so women are serving, perhaps they're working in the offices of the occupying authorities as translators or secretaries, typical female roles. And then they can see what's on the desk. They can eavesdrop on the German plans. They can occasionally steal papers, which can be used by forgery departments in France or in Poland. There were women working in bakeries and in laundrettes, and they would note the numbers of uniform and the types of uniform coming through, or the changing garrison order for breads, and they could work out, what that meant. Or people just whose houses overlooked main thoroughfares or railway lines, and they could keep accurate records of the movement of military freight or troop movements, troop deployments around a country, which would give an indication of where Nazi Germany was thinking of invading next or where they were stockpiling weapons. So this sort of information was hugely important to the resistance, and women played a key role in bringing that information together because they just weren't so suspect. If you were an able-bodied man, especially of conscription age, moving around occupied territory, you had to have a very clear reason of why you weren't either in the army or in a prisoner of war camp or dead. Whereas women, of course, are moving all around. They're trying to look after their families. They are trying to keep family businesses going. And they are being used by the occupying authorities because they don't have enough manpower. So they're being used in offices and to support them. Even women in brothels, of course, played a very important role. Women in bars who were sort of chatting to these guys in a friendly way. And a lot of that information is being put together into important reports, microfilmed, and sent back to resistance headquarters and ultimately sent back to the Allies, to Britain and elsewhere. So women play a very strategic role in the resistance.
I love the way you describe that as their superpower, and I think you're absolutely right. A lot of these women were well connected with the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, back in the UK, which was the formal organisation that was organising resistance as far as it could from the British point of view. Is this something, the use of women in these key roles, was this something that was embraced by the SOE and used as a tool, or is it only in hindsight that we now recognise the extreme value that these women played in these roles?
No, the SOE were very forward-thinking in this regard. So the British Armed Forces at this point, they did not allow women to be armed they could be in the armed forces, they could serve as drivers, as secretaries and medics and a number of different roles, but they weren't allowed to be armed themselves and to be in the front line of fire. But this organisation, the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, they are so important because they were outside the actual official military structures. And yet, so they could be armed and they were still trained and uniformed. And so the SOE worked deliberately with the Fannies, and they either recruited members of that organisation, or they recruited other women who had particular skills they needed, like language skills or very good at wireless transmission, perhaps with the WAF, the Air Force, Women's Air Force Auxiliary. And then they would recruit them into this organisation, the Fanny, the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, and then recruit them into SOE. So they went that way so that they could be armed and still have some legal protections as combatants under the Geneva Convention. And SOE, I mean, the first woman to serve as a special agent in Britain was Christina Scarbeck, one of my book subjects. And she signed up before women were legally allowed, before SOE was established. And it's partly because she was so effective in the field, and perhaps we can talk a bit about that later, that SOE's eyes were opened. And you actually see in some of their training manuals, they use some of the tactics that she used in the field. You can see them putting it in as sort of tips and hints for future women and men, in fact, being sent out into the field. And the SOE, they trained huge numbers of men. We're talking many thousands, but also they sent to France 39 women, of whom I'm sad to say that 13 did not return. And they were sent largely in two roles. They were to be wireless transmitters, very highly trained, so in Morse and in coding and in transmitting as well, but also as couriers, because women were so much more able to move around occupied territory under the radar. So they were sent in those roles. But of course, what happened there, so we worked in units of three. There'd be a circuit leader, always a man, and a courier and a wireless transmitter. But quite often that circuit leader might be arrested or get killed. And the women then stand up. So you end up with women doing all roles as well, including leading men into battle. We have women like Nancy Wake, we know, and women like Pearl Witherington, who led a Maquis force. So the Maquisards are some of the French resistance and led them into battle. So you get women playing all roles.
It's really quite extraordinary, especially when you say 13 out of 39 died in operation. That's a huge percentage. This is a little broader than the topic we're specifically discussing, but I'm interested to get your perspective on this. A few months ago, I did a fascinating interview with a historian from the Imperial War Museum about the role of women during the First World War. And a lot of that was focused on munitions factories and nursing and those things we'd expect. And it led us to discuss this concept that we look back on the 1960s as a great women's movement, and I put forward the position that I thought in both world wars there were huge leaps forward in roles for women, in women demonstrating what they could do. Not so much in a way where it was accepted on an ongoing basis, that often they were expected after the wars to go back to their housekeeping roles. But I thought that it was remarkable, particularly in terms of women demonstrating what they could do to a sometimes reluctant male population, that the wars seemed to me to completely destroy this notion of don't worry your pretty little head about it, and women not being capable. Women were demonstrating what they could do, and there's nothing that demonstrates that more than actually serving, not only on the front lines, but in the resistance on the front lines and for SOE and this incredibly dangerous and stressful work. What are your comments about women and their roles in wartime and how that certainly enhanced the role of women?
Yeah, I mean, you are right. It tended to be, one step forward, one step back, really. So in the First World War, you had women serving in those roles you mentioned, but you did actually have women serving in intelligence roles behind enemy lines in France in the First World War. They were called the Hushwacks. There's some wonderful stories there. And after the war, of course, they were all expected to fall back into the home. But we do have this shift. Before the First World War, we had the big suffragette movement, suffragist movement, pushing for women's enfranchisement. And after the war, that is when we start to get the enfranchisement of women, not on equal terms initially, but it does. There is this historical association between serving your country and being enfranchised. If you serve your country, you should have citizen rights, full rights. And this is for a number of minorities through history. You see this connection being drawn, and that is drawn for women as well. So there is progress. But of course, the majority of women were sent back. And then it was a real fight again in the Second World War for women. And in fact, this organisation, the Fannies, I keep mentioning, some of the women, a wonderful woman called Marion Gamwell, who had helped to run them in the First World War, comes back from retirement in the Second World War to push for them again, and has this real battle on her hands to push for them to get the same kind of roles and more in the Second World War. But when SOE comes on board, they realise the value of having women in this organisation outside military structures, which means they can be armed and go into service. So these women are armed, they're given all the same training as the men. So that's fitness, orienteering, all that kind of hardship stuff. Same muddy fields, same aching legs, all of that's the same. And then they're also trained in the use of weapons and ammunition, and they're put on the silent killing course. That's the course Christina Skarbek, excelled in, apparently. So silent killing is just killing with a knife. She would have a Fairburns and Sykes commando knife, which we've still got, actually, a rope, or your bare hands. And that was the course she excelled in, although there's no evidence that she killed anyone in the war. She said her knife was her favourite weapon, but clearly her best weapon was her brain. She's absolutely brilliant the way she talks her way in and out of situations. So these women were very highly trained. And then at the end of the Second World War, again, there is that step back where after demobilisation, there was huge structural issues in Britain. There was unemployment, people are coming back. You've got huge numbers of Poles now who are going to stay here because they can't go back to Soviet-backed communist regime in Poland, which is out to kill a lot of the resistance leaders. So you have that. And just this massive social shift. You get a real spike in violent crime. And women are expected to sort of return to familiar supportive roles. But of course, there is progress. So slowly there is progress.
It reminds me of a letter that I read when I was researching one of my First World War books, written by a woman, a letter to the editor in I think it was the Argus down in Melbourne, but a fiery letter basically saying that don't think that women are just sitting around and not contributing to this war effort. And she spelt out that for the women of Australia, there is only one colour, and that is red heat. You know, she was a very fiery letter which ended with, and trust us, if the men fail, the women won't. And it's just reflective again. I think that the situation is what enabled her to step forward and be so forthright.
Women, like Christina Scarbeck, she was born a countess and she was expected to dance the polonaise and have a white fan, that sort of thing. And this wasn't what she was born for. She, as a young child, she would break in wild horses to impress her father. He taught her to shoot a gun. She could ride, not side saddle. She's doing the whole thing. And this woman wanted to take centre stage. I've always thought it ironic that secret agent is an anagram of centre stage. It's sort of secretly they are. It's ironically perhaps what we think of, still tend to be thought of as a male sphere. War actually gave a lot of these women the opportunities to shine, to lead an active life, to do something of great value for their country on the front line. And these women, they were deeply fulfilled by it, and they made a very significant contribution to the Allied war effort.
This Halloween, ghoul all out with Instacart. Whether you're hunting for the perfect costume, eyeing that giant bag of candy, or casting spells with eerie decor, we've got it all in one place. Download the Instacart app and get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes. Plus, enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 orders. Offer valid for a limited time, minimum $10 per order, service fees, other fees, and additional terms apply. Instacart, bringing the store to your door this Halloween.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Well, let's. You've made a career out of telling their stories, so let's do an abridged version right now. Let's start with Christine Granville, the lady whose plaque I saw fortuitously in Lexham Gardens. You wrote a fantastic book about her, which I enjoyed very much. But tell us her story.
Well, it's hard to do it briefly because she's so extraordinary, but she was the first woman to serve Britain as a special agent in the Second World War. And she was actually the longest serving agent, male or female, and one of the most high achieving. She served in 3 different theatres of the war. So she started off it's wonderful actually. She made her way. She was in South Africa with her second husband when war broke out. So they turned around, took a passenger ship, got back to Britain. He went off to join the Polish forces that were regrouping in France at that point. And he said, have a couple of cocktails, darling. I'll see you in London when it's over in a couple of months. And of course, she was like, it might all be over before I get to serve. So she was quick to find the supposedly secret headquarters of the British Secret Services and didn't so much volunteer as demanded to be taken on. And these young men, they were horrified, really, because, first of all, she was a Polish national. She was born a Polish national. She became a British citizen and lived in Britain after the war in that hotel with the plaques. And and she was a woman, and of course there were no women in this role, but she knew the right contacts across Poland. She could speak all the right languages, so she obviously had Polish, she had very fluent English, perfect French, a little bit of German, and she knew the routes in and out, secret routes in and outs of Poland, because when she was a rather bored countess, she used to do a lot of skiing, and when she got bored of out skiing all the men, she used to smuggle cigarettes across the border, and she didn't even smoke. One of the few women in the 1930s that didn't smoke. She just did it for kicks, for the thrill. But it meant that she knew the smuggling routes in and out across the mountains. And so she could get information in that the British were keen to get into the fledgling Polish resistance and get the first information out from the first occupied country, which we were desperate to know about. So they took her on, and in the file they describe her as a flaming Polish patriot, a great adventuress, and one of them put in the corner, "She terrifies me." So that was just written in pencil. It's still in the files. It's wonderful. So,
Claire, I just wanted to say here that there seemed to be a type with these women, isn't it? It wasn't just random people plucked off the street. There seemed to be these big personalities, this determination, this drive to make a difference. Did you find that across all the women you've studied?
No, I have looked at a lot of them, and there are some commonalities. Okay, SOE was only going to take people who they thought weren't there for the vainglory, but were deeply patriotic. They had to have the physical skills, the fitness. They had to have the training. They had to have the language skills, and preferably a knowledge of the country that they were being sent to. So there were a number of things they all had in common. But actually, they are this massively diverse bunch. There isn't like lots of different men and one woman type. They're incredibly diverse. So you have very young women, you have mothers like Violette Szabo, you have, there's a grandmother, you have women of all different nationalities, including German Jewish women, a Russian lady, Poles, of course. You have all faiths. So we have, there's 3 Jewish women employed by SOE. There's a Sufi Muslim woman, Noor Inyat Khan, who serves in France very bravely, one of those who did not return. And there's people who have no faith at all. So, I mean, there's one woman who had an artificial leg. There are siblings, 2 sisters and a brother. So you get a full range, full diversity. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about this story, is that it shows us the diversity of the sources that ultimately, collectively, it took to bring victory. And that diversity is within every gender, both genders as well. So that is interesting. Yeah. So anyhow, do you want me to carry on about Christina?
Yeah, back to Christine. What were her exploits during the war? So where did she end up after her training?
I'll have to speed up a bit. So
I know I've put you on the spot a little bit to summarize someone's entire life in 10 minutes, but okay. I'm enjoying it immensely.
Thank you. The headlines, if you like, perhaps are that she served first in Hungary and Poland, so in Eastern Europe, where she is skiing across the high Tatra mountains, sometimes minus 40 degrees, enough to freeze the birds to death. Certainly, she found a number of bodies of people trying to get out who had frozen to death in the mountains. But she kept going, and she managed to bring in information, contacts to make radio contact in future, and money to give to the fledgling resistance. And then she would go around the country. She made 4 missions go around the country and basically find out where the troops were moving, that sort of thing, bring that military information back. She brought back microfilm smuggled inside her leather gloves as she skied back over the mountains. And in fact, she brought some of the most important microfilm, which was sent straight to Churchill, which showed the massing of, this is in 1941, showed the massing of tanks and troops on what was then the German side of the German-Soviet border. It was the first film evidence of Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler would betray his erstwhile ally Stalin and invade Soviet-held territory. And Churchill, when he received this information, he said, "Whoever brought me this, they are my favourite spy." So we know in 1941 she was Churchill's favourite spy. He told his daughter that. And so this is when Hitler's invasion gets Nazi Germany invades Soviet space.
Sorry, Claire, my young son has just popped in to say hello.
Hello.
Well, you might as well say hello now, James. This is James.
What a gorgeous boy, for those who can't say. And there's a gorgeous mum as well.
That's my wife, Jess. Say hello to Claire.
Sorry. Hi
there. We got a hello, Claire.
Hi, lovely to meet you.
I will leave you to it.
Come on, Bobby. Say hello, Daddy. Bye, Daddy.
Yeah, bye, buddy. Have a good bath.
What a sweetheart.
Sorry about that. The joys of working from home.
The total joy. Yeah. Anyhow, so she's smuggling very important microfilm. She does various roles in that area, but eventually gets her name becomes known. She's arrested. She manages to get out from arrest. Incredibly daring. I mean, her sang-froid is amazing. The way that she actually bit her own tongue during interrogation hard and repeatedly until her mouth filled with blood, and then she coughed, and it looked as if she was coughing up blood, which looked like tuberculosis. And the Germans were terrified of this disease, which is carried by waterborne droplets. Basically. Interrogation and TB don't go together very well. So they threw her out, and it saved her life, it saved the life of the man who they'd arrested with her. I mean, she's arrested more than once and thinks of brilliant ways to get herself out. It's just unheard of. And then she served in Egypt and the Middle East, and then she was parachuted, the only woman parachuted from North Africa to France, occupied France, to support the work in preparation for D-Day in the South. And it's there that the work she undertook made her really legendary. It includes securing the defection of an entire Nazi German garrison in the Alps. So really a remarkable woman.
Just extraordinary. And was she recognised after the war for these great achievements?
Yes, she was. She was very highly honoured by the British. They gave her the OBE and the George Medal. The French gave her the Croix de Guerre with star. She never received Polish honours because she was working directly for the British Crown, and after the war she became a British citizen and took the name Christine Granville. So both those names are on her blue plaque. And I stayed at that hotel last week, actually, in the room looking out, because that's where she lived. I wanted to, be in those same rooms as her. And without giving too much away, I mean, unfortunately she did survive the war, but she was murdered after the war in 1952. Came to a very terrible end, very unfair. So yes, a very dramatic,
a tragic end for someone who gave so much during the war years. It was, as we said,
Absolutely.
people should go and read the book to find the full story. But I was when I saw the plaque and then looked up her story, I was touched by that very sad end.
Yeah, but I mean, let's remember her as her high achieving in the French mountains, or that's how we should remember her.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the new book, the one that's just come out. It's available now. Okay, this one's about, I'm going to try this. My Polish is terrible, but I'm going to say Elżbieta Zawadzka. How did I go?
Very impressive. I won't tell anyone that I just told you how to say it, but yeah.
Yeah, you preempted me. I was getting it very badly wrong,
I
wrote it down almost, verbatim and quoted it well. My Polish is terrible, but tell us her story, because this is an absolutely remarkable story told in your new book, Agent Zoe. So tell us a little bit about her.
Yeah, so her codename is Zoe. So Elżbieta Zawadzka, known in Britain as Elizabeth Watson, but she's hardly known at all, and her codename was Zoe. During the war. So absolutely fantastic woman. Again, I don't want to give it all away. The book's just out, but she was so much to say for her. She was the only person to parachute from Britain to Nazi-occupied Poland in a dress, because she was the only woman who was sent on that route. Of course, she was also, wearing a heavy overcoat and a parachute dropsuit with 2 revolvers, some cyanide tablets, a shovel and a torch. She's properly kitted out. But yes, so she was the only woman in the Polish elite special forces, their paras, who were called the Cichociemni, which means the silent unseen. And they were selected. They basically 35,000 Polish troops got out of Poland at the start of the war, and Zoe actually helped to keep that route open. They got out, went to France, served in France, and then got to Britain, some through Dunkirk, but often from ports further to the east, actually, got up to Britain and were posted to Scotland. She didn't leave with them. She served in uniform at the start of the war, but then decided that she could play a greater role in the Resistance Home Army. So she managed to get back to Warsaw, and she set up a women's intelligence network, doing some of the work I mentioned earlier on, and getting this very vital information out to the Polish government in exile, first in France and then in London. So she ran this circuit, but then she also took on the role of being a resistance courier. So she was taking this information. We've still got her clothes brush with the back that slides out, and she would hide information there with aid memoirs in it for everything, the statistics that she had to remember. But we've also got a door key that the shaft comes out. You can pull it out and you could wind microfilm down and hide it in the key. She used those. She also used cigarette lighters, all sorts of things, and would smuggle information. And she spoke fluent German. And she had conveniently blonde hair and blue eyes. So they sent her on the most perilous routes, which was taking microfilm all the way from occupied Warsaw into the heart of the Nazi Third Reich, which was Berlin itself. because in Berlin they had contacts at a friendly embassy who could send this information out in the diplomatic post. So it was incredibly dangerous, but it was the fastest route to get time-sensitive information out to the Allies. So she was one of the main couriers on this route, going right into Berlin and out again. And then she would smuggle orders back from the Home Army head office or from the overseas Allies, orders back to the military in Poland, information and huge amounts of money that she would hide in her clothes, sewn into the lining of her skirts, into her belt, or she would paste them inside suitcases and then sew lining material on top of it and bring that back to the resistance. She did this route. She crossed borders, she said, over 100 times before she decided it was probably bad luck to keep counting, but she didn't stop going. She kept going. There's all these accounts of her going like a whirlwind, they say, across the borders. But inevitably, eventually, she was betrayed. And a number of the women in her circuit were round up, including her sister, her younger sister, Clara, who she was incredibly close to. Clara was sent to Ravensbrück. Clara actually survived the war, I'm delighted to say, and married very happily after the war. But their brother, Egon, he was sent to Auschwitz, and it's very clear he was murdered there. We have all those details. It's just appalling. So Zoe was incredibly motivated, as you might imagine. Anyhow, when her circuit was broken, she managed to escape the Gestapo, who followed her onto a train. I mean, this incredible journey, and she manages, eventually in the middle of the night, she leaps from a moving train and manages to get away from them. She gets quite badly battered, but manages to escape. But it's clear then she's burnt on those routes. And at that point, she becomes the only female emissary for the commander of an Allied army in the war. So she represents the head of the Home Army, and he sends her on a mission with vital microfilm to London, which sounds like, it's like a holiday package. But no, she has to cross nearly 1,000 miles of enemy-occupied territory. She includes going into Berlin again, despite the fact her face and name are known. But she has to do that route again and then go out, get across the border into occupied France. She's nearly arrested in France. They took her papers, her forged papers. They took them. They said, these look suspicious, but can you come back in the morning? She didn't know whether to flee or come back, but she held her nerve and thought, I'll risk it. So she went back knowing that she was likely to be arrested and brutally interrogated and shot. She went back and they said, thank you. And they gave her papers back. They said, these are such good papers. We wanted to compare them against a suspected forgery, which was someone else's papers. So she carried on. She had to hide in the water tender of Pierre Laval's steam train. And she eventually got into the Pyrenees, and she was shot at in the mountain passes, but managed to get away and eventually got via a troop ship to Britain. It's an incredible journey. And was interrogated by MI6. Couldn't believe who'd fallen into their hands, but the interrogation report is wonderful. The officer says, she seems rather reluctant to give information to me because she wanted to talk first to her Polish contacts. She was holding it all for them. And then handed over this extraordinary cachet of information. And then they said, thank you, you've done amazing service. You're a woman, your war is over. Where would you like to stay? And she's like, what are you talking about? I've got to go back into active service. And they said, well, you can't, because the only way back would be to parachute. And obviously you're a lady. So she said, well, I'll do it immediately. So she had to go through training. At this point, she joins this elite special force of men. They creamed off the top 2,000, and only just over 500 had passed this very hard training, which was done with the SOE. And it's a secret story at the heart of the English countryside that they're training these people in English country houses. And so she becomes the only female silent unseen. And she trains the guys as well in what to expect behind enemy lines when they return. And then she parachutes back in a blue silk dress. And when she gets back to Poland, she takes a strategically very important role in the largest organised act of defiance against Nazi Germany in the war, which is the Warsaw Uprising. And she survives. It's just fantastic. But I mean, the book's much more than that. But that gives you a sort of top line.
I tell you what, Claire, if that's the sneaky little trailer for what we could expect in the book, I could see why you wanted to tell her story, because it's just extraordinary. I can't get past the concept that in order to smuggle information out of occupied Poland, she had to go to Berlin. I mean, How did she deal with the stress? I couldn't even do this for a few minutes, let alone for years. How do these people deal with the stress of risking getting caught and executed every day?
She is an incredibly tough woman. There is no question of that. And she talks about her friends. She survives, and she's on record talking about her friends. And I managed to trace some of these friends are on record as well. And they say, well, she called me a friend, but really she terrified me. So you get that sort of sense of her character as well. But she wasn't unvulnerable. She's not a superhero. She is. She's terrified of heights. Ever since she jumped from the moving train, she becomes terrified of heights. And then she has to undertake parachute training, which involves dropping from a huge sort of pylon and then dropping from a 4-engine Halifax bomber several times, because you have to do that during training and then in your operations. And then as she's being flown out, she hears that horrendously scary sound of kind of like fairground pinging of flak hitting metal. And they're being shot at. The anti-aircraft batteries are shooting at her aircraft and hitting it, and they plow on. And then she has to jump, knowing that's what's below. So she's not unafraid, but she surmounts it. That's real courage, right?
Absolutely. And as you said, the story of Agent Zoe hasn't been told. This is not so. This should be a story that's on that everyone knows about. It should be headline news even today. It's wonderful that you've told this story now, but how should we remember these women and these amazing feats and this incredible contribution to the war?
Well, the reason why Zoe's story is not known is because on VE Day in the West, in Britain, we're celebrating in Trafalgar Square. There's parties and bunting everywhere. And in Poland, the first of the Allies, really, the first country invaded, and Britain and France went to war because of the invasion of Poland. They are left with a Soviet-imposed communist regime. And that regime rounds up thousands of heads of the resistance, the men, and they execute many of them. They're now called the cursed soldiers, and they're sort of known in that category. And then when films started coming out, like the wonderful black and white films like Odette or Carve Her Name with Pride, we finally began to realise that women had played a part, and there was some recognition, I've got to say very much romanticised, but nevertheless, I love those films. And the Poles, in Poland, the communists also began to recognise that women had played a role. And in 1951, Zoe was arrested. It's one of the great ironies of her story that she survived 6 years from the very first day of the war right till the end, and she was never arrested. She was very close to it, but never arrested during that time, despite all she achieved. And yet after the war, she's arrested by her own government for the country that she served, putting her life on the line for all those years. And they tortured her and they sentenced her initially to 5 years, and it was appealed, and she ended up with 10 years. They let her go before that, actually. She was released early. But even when they released her after 4 years service, 4 years time, they made sure that her story was hidden. And the communists, that they rewrote the narrative of the war. So retelling the story of the women gives us a much truer picture of, the full picture of what was going on. And I think we need to remember these stories, particularly, I think, in that theatre, because it has been far less told, because it's been deliberately hidden, and also because nowadays, with the war that's going on at the moment, it feels very resonant. And a lot of the time when I was doing my research, these stories of women making petrol bombs in the basement of sports halls in Lviv, now Lviv in Ukraine. And then I'd listen to Radio 4, and there were radio reports of women making petrol bombs in the basements of buildings in Lviv, the same place. And so it feels that this is really important history that we really need to know today.
Well, I agree. They're wonderful stories, and you're doing wonderful work telling them, and in your latest books, including the latest one, Agent Zoe, which is out now, and I'd recommend everyone go out and grab a copy of that. Claire, thank you for taking the time. It's been fantastic. I feel we've just scratched the surface of these amazing stories, and hopefully it encourages people to go out and do some of their own research and learn more about what is a really vital chapter of history. So thank you for joining us and telling us this story.
It's been a real pleasure. Lovely to meet you, and lovely to meet your son. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistorytv.com for more great history content.
Hi, I'm Master Model Builder Andrew at the LEGO Discovery Center, Washington, D.C., inviting you to our family Halloween event, Brick or Treat, now through the 31st. Enjoy monsterific activities and a 4D LEGO Halloween movie. Get tickets today at legodiscoverycenter.com/Washington, D.C.